So that title, Survival of the Fittest, or just the Most Rested. So it's my job to convince you it's that bit in parentheses, that rest has something to do with how well we all are, or could be. And of course, to do that, I have to talk about sleep, and therefore my great interest. And the first thing to say, as everyone will know, sleep is inescapable. So we all know, therefore, it must be important. And all animals sleep, all creatures sleep, birds, bees, nothing doesn't sleep. There was a time when we thought that was some creatures didn't sleep. And if that's the case, then you can imagine well that this statement must be true. If sleep doesn't serve some vital function, it's the biggest mistake that evolution ever made. That man, Rechtschaffen, is a famous sleep researcher. And that has to be true. So, first of all, what is sleep? I think we all know it again because we do it. And we can identify people asleep because they're immobile and non-communicative. But a nice way of thinking about it was the US Supreme Court Justice Potter, who said, or Potter Stevens, who said about obscenity, "I know it when I see it." So we know what sleep is in the sense that we know when someone's asleep. But that being the case, why do we sleep? Again, the answer might be as simple as the one made by William Dement, the co-discoverer of REM sleep, a psychiatrist called Dement, who said, "We sleep to prevent sleepiness." And that's still a very reasonable concept for you to take away. And it clearly is restorative and allows us to perform adequately in the day, and that's its importance. But to be more scientific about it, there are things known about why we sleep. There is a homeostatic effect. I think you'll remember from your school days, homeostasis means balancing out things. Well, something accumulates in wakefulness that drives us to sleep. That substance is believed to be adenosine. That's not important. The first studies done to identify the hypnotoxin were done on goats, large enough creatures that could be subjected to a lumbar puncture. So when goats are sleep deprived and the lumbar puncture fluid is taken and injected into well-rested goats, those goats go to sleep. So something accumulates in wakefulness that promotes sleep. And this will become evident later on in this talk as well. And the other thing that affects sleep is time of day. I think something we all would be aware of again, the circadian effect, circadian around the day. There's a pressure to sleep, which is greatest at night between 2 and 6 a.m. and in the middle of the afternoon, sadly at this time. Why do I always get put on at this time? I have got my beady eyes on you all. But these are inherent times when if we need to sleep, we will sleep. Road traffic accidents are at their peak at those two times. So it's the night and the middle of the afternoon. That's a circadian effect. And the question asked a moment ago is, how much do we need? Now, this is an interesting question. The studies have been done which would suggest that it's 8.1 hours. Now, to get down to that finer number, the research must have been reasonable. The research is done, though, by taking a group of young, healthy people like yourselves off to Bermuda and allowing them to sleep as much as they want, and then settling down to what is the average for you all. So it's about when they get there, first of all, or when you get there, it'll be 9 hours or 10, making up for your inevitable sleep deprivation as working people. But then it settles down to 8 hours. Now, that's not what people get at large. A week ago, the publications suggested it was less than 7 hours. And other publications have repeatedly indicated that about 20% of the population only get, or less than, 6 hours sleep. So there's a sleep debt that's out there amongst you and amongst society. So does that matter? I mean, can't we just cope and learn to do with that less sleep? Well, in order to answer that question, the there are a couple of things one could do. The straightforward thing is to sleep deprive animals. And this has been done, and this image I'll come back to, but there have been two main studies of sleep deprivation in animals. First in dogs at the turn of the last century. And dogs who are not allowed to sleep will die in 3 days. If they're deprived of food and water, they die in 9 or 10 days. So lack of sleep is worse than lack of food. The more remembered experiments are done on rats. And again, if you sleep deprive rats and that they don't sleep at all, they will die in 2 weeks. They die losing fur, losing weight, even though their appetite is increased. We'll come back to that. With a gut which degrades like septic shock. And if they're deprived of one of the two types of sleep, and I haven't touched on this, but sleep is both passive, non-rapid eye movement, and active, rapid eye movement, dreaming sleep. If they're deprived of just dreaming sleep, and that can be done because when we go into dreaming sleep, all of us, we're physically paralyzed, literally, to stop us acting out our dreams. And so if rats do that, they collapse and they fall off on whatever they've been placed on, so they don't get REM sleep. These rats die in 4 weeks. And also the male rats are described as being hypersexual. And in the paper they mentioned them humping rocks. That we could come back to as a separate issue. But so rats, animals will die if you deprive them of sleep. So what about humans? Well, the first time that someone really looked at being sleep deprived was this Peter Tripp, a New York disc jockey who was trying to raise money for the March of Dimes in 1959 and decided he would not sleep, and yet he carried on doing his 3-hour broadcast each day and managed that. He didn't sleep for 8 days and was sort of all right at the end of that, but 3 months later killed himself. And the community at the time were very worried that there was a serious psychiatric implication from not sleeping. A Californian gardener, just in 1956, took it a bit further. He went out to 11 days, and a group at UCLA at the same time did the same. Now, he didn't come to grief. Nothing bad happened. He was sleepy, as you'd expect. But you know, you can't really equate the animal experiments with these short periods of sleep deprivation. We're big animals. Maybe we need to be sleep deprived for longer to come to a bad end. Sadly, there is an experiment of nature, an insomnia, which becomes fatal, called fatal familial insomnia. It's a prion disease, where once the patient becomes insomniac and does not sleep hardly at all, they can expect to die in 6 months. Now, that's an anecdote. It's not in any sense proven, but it gives you an idea that we are large enough, maybe if we slept deprived for long enough, we'd be like those animals. But what about a more pragmatic clinical aspect to this? What are the acute effects of not sleeping? Here's one, and we've all perhaps been subject to this. Sleepiness clearly is something that develops when we don't sleep. It's a consequence. I already said we sleep to prevent sleepiness. So that's one effect that's noticeable. The other is on performance, and I'm going to show a graph now. My son said, get rid of that, but I thought it was worthwhile. I'd like you to focus on the bottom element here. And here in the vertical axis, there's a measure of some sort of capability, a reaction test. And along the bottom, the time that you've been awake. And you'll all be able to see that by the time you get to 16 hours of wakefulness, there's a rapid decline in performance as measured in that way. That's a reaction time. So the idea that we have at the moment is that cumulative wakefulness leads to a point of then declining performance, and that number is 15 to 16 hours. Go to the top and you'll see a similar sort of declining function, but this is relating to blood alcohol concentration. The same measure on the vertical axis, but now the amount of alcohol you have. Hence the idea that being sleep deprived is like being drunk. And that's the concept that one has in terms of driving now. And people are looking for ways to measure sleepiness at the wheel in the way that we could measure alcohol at the wheel. The other effect, which is a slightly more subtle one, and again, may seem overly complicated, but let me walk you through this. There are effects on judgment as well. The frontal lobes are particularly susceptible to lack of sleep, and the frontal lobe is where we all sit and wonder about things and make the right judgment or don't take risks. Well, someone had the idea of using Google Trends over a 6-year period and looking for words that were searched that were moral in context, fraud, guilty, honesty, versus words which were nothing to do with morality over a 6-year period, and put a cumulative number out for a Monday morning, any Monday morning, a certain number. When this was done on the Monday after a summer savings time, with 1 hour's less sleep, there was a significant and measurable decline in people accessing moral words. So a lack of moral awareness comes with 1 hour's lack of sleep, and risk-taking might increase. I thought that might be relevant for Moorgate. And so those are acute effects. And what about the chronic effects? These are on metabolism and appetite. So this is where the conference perhaps begins to come to its unity. This is an example. These are the North Sea oil rig, which is again an experiment of nature, because here men, usually working nights for 7 nights, then days for 7 days, nights for 7 nights, and so on. When they're at the end of their night shift, these people become insulin resistant, if you like, pre-diabetic. And that's because they don't sleep well in the day. Shift workers on average can only sleep about 5 hours, and therefore they're sleep deprived, and therefore there is an effect on the adrenaline system, and adrenaline makes insulin less capable, and therefore one becomes pre-diabetic. So that's a cycle these people are going through, and it goes to some way it's supported by laboratory research, where if you restrict someone's sleep to 5 hours, very severe, they will become pre-diabetic after less than a week. The other effect is on hunger signals, and these same people who are sleep deprived by being shift workers or people in the laboratory, the hormones that drive hunger are altered very significantly. There are two. One is called ghrelin, it comes from the stomach. That's increased by 20%. That stimulates appetite. And the satiety hormone, leptin, is reduced by 20%. So appetite goes up with sleep deprivation, lack of sleep. And that's been measured in terms of people's consumptions. And hence, I would wonder whether it has anything to do with the epidemic of obesity. These numbers are not so relevant, but we've heard before, 2/3 of our population is overweight, and it's getting worse. And does a lack of sleep have anything to do with that? There are longitudinal studies which would suggest that children that don't sleep as much as others will become heavier. So that's my plea for sleep and the epidemic of obesity. And then finally, the perfect storm. There are also disturbances of sleep, which I deal with. It's my bread and butter. On the left of this slide, you see I've mentioned insomnia, extremely common. 30% of the population at any one point in the year will have some difficulty sleeping. And the physiology of that 1/3 of the population is measurably different than the other 2/3. Can't be abnormal, it's so many people. But adrenaline levels are higher, cortisol levels are higher, making that physiology hyper-arousable, so susceptible to insomnia. And then 1/3 of that 1/3, that's 1 in 10 people here in this audience, that problem carries on because it can. It becomes an ingrained behavior, and sleep is deficient. There is an idea that that might be physically impairing, but there's no hard evidence for that yet. The treatment, of course, is around changing behavior, and that might include attention to exercise at the right time, no caffeine, avoidance of light exposure towards bedtime. And it was mentioned to me a moment ago because the development of Apple's night watch, the dialing out of blue light from your phones and computers, the blue light being the signal to the clock that you don't want at night. So that's insomnia, the common problem. And then snoring and sleep apnea, that's the other common problem. Snoring itself, everyone knows of its existence. Half of men in middle age snore badly, and about a quarter of women. And that happens because the anatomy allows it. The airway is narrow enough. It's not abnormal, it's inherited. It's the most heritable thing we found in the Thomas's twin population, snoring. And the very fact the airway is narrow enough to allow snoring in sleep, you can imagine it might narrow enough to close off. And we call that sleep apnea. That's also extremely common. A half of snorers have some stopped breathing when they're asleep. That's 1 in 4 men then you see on the street when you leave here. And then a fewer number have more interruptions. And these interruptions disturb sleep with arousals, increasing the secretion of adrenaline. They disturb sleep through falls in oxygen, which can also be damaging. Now, what are the consequences of this condition, which, again, I see so much of? And I'd like to go to a slide I made in 1984 when I was at UCLA. The point of it is that we were wondering then, what are the general effects of sleep apnea, this common breathing disturbance at night? And they are listed on the far right of that slide. So with the brain, stroke, sleepiness, motor vehicle accidents, dementia, that question mark might almost be taken off now. The dementia community is very interested in lack of sleep and poor sleep as a drive to some of that. Hypertension, this is certainly a consequence of sleep apnea, and an accepted one now. And then kidney problems. There is an idea, but real, that kidney function declines in the threat of the lack of oxygen of sleep apnea. And also, I've come back to the hormone issue, that the satiety hormone and ghrelin are also altered in sleep apnea, driving appetite. So to finish, let me just give you my concept of why I think that sleep is very important in all these areas. And sleep is altered, I've put here, meaning that society is driving us towards a little bit too little sleep, and perhaps other lifestyle issues. And that might lead to some degree of obesity. Now, just to buy into this for a moment, appetite increases, and we're getting fatter and we don't sleep enough, so perhaps they are related. And that might generate sleep apnea, because sleep apnea is worsened by the obesity. There are fat pads alongside the airway which expand with the rest of you to narrow that airway. So any weight gain will promote sleep apnea, and that alters sleep. And the altered sleep and sleep apnea lead to a sympathetic activation, more adrenaline. And that leads to hypertension, a well-documented consequence of sleep apnea, and to diabetes. 95% of people with diabetes have some sleep apnea, and that's US data. In this country, 1/4 have moderate to severe sleep apnea. There has to be some link, not only weight, but some other link. And then diabetes might worsen obesity. So this is a concept relating to sleep apnea, but I'd like you to keep in mind that lack of sleep itself can drive some of these problems that we've been talking about today. And that if we could only sleep more and better, we might do better for ourselves and our bank balances. So I'd like to think most rested is the answer, but I'm sure we'll hear in a moment other evidence that it's also being fit. But thank you for your attention.